August 31st, 1997. Diana makes a phone call from the back seat of a Mercedes in Paris. The person she calls is Richard Kay, the Daily Mail's royal correspondent, a man she has trusted for years, met in back alleys in Bayswater to keep the palace's surveillance from registering the relationship. They have been conducting a covert friendship for the better part of a decade, managing information flows through careful, off-the-record exchanges that served both of them. The call ends. The Mercedes enters the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, pursued by photographers whose commercial appetite for Diana's movements has made her the most documented private individual in the world. Investigators would later estimate the Mercedes was traveling at between 60 and 63 miles per hour at the moment of impact. Diana was 36 years old. She died in the early hours of the morning on a hospital table in Paris. Her younger son Harry was 12 years old, asleep at Balmoral when he was told the news. Kay would carry what Diana had told him across the following 28 years. He wasn't a minor figure in Diana's life. The Spectator, writing in September 1997, described him as the Daily Mail reporter she called on the night she died, and a favoured confidant. Tina Brown's biography, The Diana Chronicles, places Kay, identified as Diana's confidant at the Daily Mail, on the receiving end of her last completed phone call from Paris. In Diana World, An Obsession, Kay himself described Diana as having a hypnotic effect, not just on the tabloids, but all newspapers. He meant it as admiration. It was also an accurate description of how the relationship functioned. Diana channeled stories through trusted correspondents. Correspondents like Kay got the most valuable source in British journalism in exchange. Kay acknowledged the arrangement explicitly in a 2003 Guardian piece, admitting he had, in his own words, allowed himself to be used in relation to Diana. He has won the title of Royal Reporter of the Year. For at least 5 to 6 years of Diana's life, he was closer to her than almost any journalist alive. In March 2026, Kay recorded an episode of the Daily Mail's Palace Confidential podcast, Season 1, Episode 40, published on the 10th of March. The episode title left nothing to interpretation. Princess Diana told me she was preparing Prince Harry to be king. The story was reported in the Daily Mail on March 12th, on page 6 on March 11th, and across Fox News, MSN, Yahoo, and AOL within 3 days. On the 13th of March, Kay appeared on Good Morning Britain to discuss the claims in detail. What he had said in the podcast, as reported across those outlets, was this: Diana used to call her youngest son Good King Harry. A throwback, Kay explained, to medieval days, a reference to Henry V, the medieval king celebrated in Shakespeare's histories. Beyond the nickname, Kay said, Diana was, in her own mind, preparing the way for the possibility that Harry, rather than William, would succeed their father. She had told Kay she believed William never really wanted the top job. 2 royal experts were asked to respond on Good Morning Britain the morning the story circulated. Richard Fitzwilliams offered the cautious reading. Diana may have thought it, he said, but she was also deeply emotional and often erratic, and Harry was only 12 when she died. She couldn't have known by then. A second expert was more precise. Diana was very sensitive to Harry feeling second best, so calling him Good King Harry feels like emotional equalization rather than constitutional foresight. The monarchy, this expert noted, has never been uncertain about succession, only about sentiment. Diana understood the emotional cost of the role better than most. Both readings deserve their due. Kay is recalling private conversations with a woman who died in 1997, 28 years before he described them on an Acast podcast. No letter, no diary entry, no contemporaneous document has been produced to corroborate his memory. His employer, the Daily Mail, has never reduced its commercial interest in Diana content. The phrase, reported across multiple outlets, "she used to call him," implies repetition, but the frequency, context, and seriousness of the nickname's use rest entirely on Kay's single recollection. Kay's account, noted with those qualifications, nonetheless points towards something that Harry's own documented statements across the past 5 years make unmistakably clear. His mother, who understood the institution better than almost anyone who had ever lived within it, reportedly believed privately that he had the character for what the crown required. Understanding what that private belief did to a boy growing up inside an institution that officially disagreed requires starting with what Diana herself understood and how she came to understand it. Diana Spencer married Charles at St. Paul's Cathedral on the 29th of July, 1981. She was 20 years old, the third daughter of Earl Spencer, aristocratic by birth but entirely unprepared for the institutional machinery she was entering. The first decade inside the palace was an education in how the communications apparatus worked, and, specifically, how it could be deployed against its own members when they became inconvenient. By 1992, after 10 years of that education, she acted on it. Andrew Morton published Diana, Her True Story in 1992, describing it as unauthorized. The book was built on secret audio recordings Diana had made herself. She cooperated covertly, allowing friends to speak to Morton, and denied any involvement to the palace throughout. The book broke the breakdown of the Wales marriage into public knowledge, established Diana's technique for managing information outside official channels, and taught the palace something it had not fully grasped. She had learned how to use the same mechanisms against the institution that the institution used against her. Charles and Diana's formal separation was announced on the 9th of December, 1992. 3 years later, Diana was ready to move much further. The 1995 Panorama interview was broadcast on BBC One on the 20th of November, 1995. 54 minutes. Martin Bashir asking the questions. An audience estimated at 23 million in the United Kingdom alone. Before filming began, Diana sent her Kensington Palace staff home early. She didn't notify the Queen. She didn't tell Charles. The palace discovered what she had done the same way everyone else did, by watching the program. What she said that evening was precise. It was the testimony of someone who had spent a decade studying a specific system and decided to describe it plainly, on the record, to the largest possible audience. "There were 3 of us in this marriage," she told Bashir. "So it was a bit crowded. On the palace's management of her public characterization, my husband's side were very busy stopping me, by visits abroad being blocked, by things that had come naturally my way being stopped, letters going that got lost, and various things. On the mechanism itself, there's no better way to dismantle a personality than to isolate it. On her institutional status after the separation, I was now the separated wife of the Prince of Wales. I was a problem. I was a liability. And how are we going to deal with her? This hasn't happened before." That final line is the most technically accurate thing she said in 54 minutes of television. The palace had no protocol for a Princess of Wales who refused to disappear. Every tool at the institution's disposal, the managed press briefings, the social exclusion, the planted descriptions of mental instability, was in service of a single logic problem. What do you do with someone you can't control, who won't cooperate in their own disappearance? Diana had identified each tool individually. She named them on the BBC to 23 million people without requesting permission. The Queen wrote to both Charles and Diana within weeks, urging immediate divorce. The divorce was finalized in August 1996. Diana was stripped of her HRH title and repositioned, formally and practically, outside the institution. 14 months after the divorce was finalized, she was dead in a Paris tunnel. pursued by photographers whose commercial appetite for her image had been created and sustained across 15 years by the same palace tabloid ecosystem she had just finished describing on national television. William was 15 when Diana died. Harry was 12. On the 6th of September 1997, they walked behind their mother's coffin through the streets of London. A crowd of approximately 1 million people lined the route. The procession was broadcast to an estimated global audience of 2.5 billion. Harry was 12 years old, in full public view, required to perform grief in the precise manner the institution demanded. His uncle, Earl Spencer, stood at the pulpit of Westminster Abbey and promised that Diana's blood family would ensure the boys' souls wouldn't be immersed by the institution she had spent her final years fighting. It was a commitment made over a coffin. The boys returned to the institution within the hour. The palace's internal response to what Diana had represented was reported in a single line in Tina Brown's 2022 book, The Palace Papers. At the highest level of the institution, the view was stated plainly: "We don't want another Diana." The anxiety was pattern recognition, not grief. Diana had demonstrated that someone inside the family could learn to identify the machine publicly, could use the press to do it, and could accumulate more popular power in the naming than the institution had ever planned for. The concern was repetition. Harry was 12. He was too young to have absorbed the full strategic complexity of Diana's 1995 testimony. He was exactly the right age to absorb the emotional core of it: that his mother had been declared a problem and a liability, that the palace's private view of her and its public face were radically opposed, and that the institution his family represented could destroy the people inside it who were honest about what it was. Richard Kay's account of Diana calling him Good King Harry, contested as it remains, sits inside that emotional context precisely. A mother who understood what the institution did to people it designated inconvenient was, reportedly, telling her younger son privately that its official assessment of him was incomplete. By Harry's own repeated public account, he didn't begin processing Diana's death for approximately 20 years. The therapeutic work required to actually examine what had happened to his mother and what her death had done to him didn't begin until his late 20s, approximately 2013 at the earliest. He has described the years between 1997 and the beginning of that work as a period of functional suppression, performing the roles required, maintaining the public persona the institution needed, and actively not examining what lay beneath. He has also described the cost of that period in terms that are specific and clinical: severe anxiety, near-complete emotional breakdown, a comprehensive collapse of his capacity to function that he has said began around the time he was in his 30s. During those years, the institution provided structure. 2 deployments to Afghanistan, the first in 2007, the second running from 2012 to 2013. His Army career gave him the kind of purpose the institution could supply: roles, uniforms, duties, the ordered world of military service. What it didn't provide was any framework for understanding that his grief wasn't ordinary bereavement, but bereavement compounded by the specific knowledge that the institution he was serving had contributed to the conditions of his mother's death and had never been held responsible. He has said publicly that he thought about Diana every single day. Daily, across 20 years, inside an institution that required him to perform normalcy at public engagements attended by photographers from the same organizations whose commercial interest had followed his mother to Paris. What Diana had described in 1995 as the mechanism, the briefings, the coordinated press management, the information architecture that could position a royal family member as mentally unstable when the institution needed them quiet, was confirmed over the following decades through legal proceedings Harry himself initiated. A British judge ruled that Harry's phone had been hacked by a tabloid publisher. The ruling found sufficient evidence in close to half the articles submitted by Harry's legal team that could be linked to phone hacking. Harry was awarded damages. He spent 2 days on the witness stand at the High Court, the first time a senior member of the royal family had testified in a British courtroom since 1890. Prince William separately settled a phone hacking claim for a sum described in press reports as very large. Harry's legal submissions went beyond his individual case. He alleged a secret agreement had existed between the royal family as an institution and the tabloid group, that the palace had agreed not to bring legal action until other high court cases concluded, in exchange for protections running in the opposite direction. He characterized this as a cover-up. The allegation was made in formal legal submissions and stated in sworn testimony. It identified the palace as an active participant in decisions about when to pursue legal accountability for tabloid intrusion rather than a passive victim of it. Academic research on the palace-press relationship, conducted separately from the hacking proceedings, had documented the operational texture of the arrangement for years. Royal correspondents on record described attending holiday parties at the palace. They noted that social proximity, moving in the same circles as the royals, was how you obtained stories about them. The relationship between palace communications offices and Fleet Street's royal desks wasn't adversarial. It was symbiotic, long-standing, and carefully tended on both sides. Diana had navigated it for 15 years, meeting journalists like Kay covertly to manage what reached the public, while the palace simultaneously used its own favoured correspondence to position her as a liability in the same press. She had described it in 1995 without the legal apparatus to prove it in court. Harry proved it 26 years later, with 2 days of sworn testimony and a damages award. Harry and Meghan announced their departure from senior royal duties on the 8th of January 2020 through a post on their own website, without palace coordination. Harry flew to Sandringham alone. Meghan remained in Canada, to meet with his father, his brother, and Queen Elizabeth at a summit the press immediately labeled Megxit. The outcome was the formalization of their departure. Harry would step back from senior duties, lose his military patronages, and no longer receive metropolitan police protection when visiting the United Kingdom. The announcement had the same structural quality as the 1995 Panorama interview. Unilateral, uncoordinated with the palace, released through a channel the institution didn't control. Diana had sent her staff home and given the interview. Harry had posted on a website. The technology had evolved across 25 years. The institutional logic was identical. A family member making a public declaration on their own terms, forcing the palace into a reactive position it had not anticipated and didn't know how to manage gracefully. The Oprah Winfrey interview aired on CBS on the 7th of March 2021. Harry and Meghan sat opposite Winfrey for 2 hours in what was, in structural terms, the most significant royal press event since the 1995 Panorama broadcast. The parallel wasn't coincidental. Harry knew what the Panorama interview was. He had watched it. He had watched what it cost his mother. He gave his own version anyway, in a Californian garden on American television, without palace approval, while the institution watched from across the Atlantic. On the mechanism Diana had described in 1995, Harry was specific and on the record. There is, he told Winfrey, what he called an invisible contract behind closed doors between the institution and the UK tabloids. He described a system of mutual protection. Neither side used its communications offices against the other. Stories were planted and exchanged, and access was traded for coverage that served the institution's interests and protected its principal members. He said he and William had both understood the mechanism well enough to vow privately never to deploy their own communications teams against each other. An admission that they both knew the teams could be weaponized, because they had watched them deployed. The Guardian's live coverage of the interview on March 8, 2021, confirmed Harry's exact language. "Invisible contract" was his own phrase, in his own words, on the record. Business Insider independently confirmed the same phrasing. The New Yorker described it as very striking, treating it as a credible characterization of a documented relationship. When Winfrey asked what his mother would think of the situation, Harry said he thought she had seen it coming. He said he felt Diana's presence throughout the entire process of leaving. His biggest fear, stated on numerous occasions very publicly, had been history repeating itself. He was drawing a specific institutional parallel, not a general thematic one. Diana had been briefed against, had her mental health questioned by palace sources feeding favoured journalists, had been positioned as a liability by the institution she married into, and had eventually been expelled from it. Harry was saying he recognized the sequence. He had been watching for it since 1997. The Oprah interview was watched by approximately 49 million viewers globally on its first night across CBS and ITV, comparable in reach to what the Panorama broadcast had achieved in November 1995. Both interviews were delivered without palace approval. Both were followed by institutional responses designed to manage the damage. In 1995, the Queen wrote privately urging divorce. In 2021, the palace issued a public statement that recollections may vary. Diana's financial inheritance gave Harry the material capacity to actually leave. After Megxit, Harry and Meghan disclosed that Charles had withdrawn his financial support. The publicly funded security and institutional infrastructure, salary, housing, staff, operational support, was gone. Diana's inheritance wasn't a withdrawal strategy. She died 14 years before Harry met Meghan and couldn't have planned for the specific circumstances of January 2020. But the money she left him was what inheritance always is: transferred autonomy. In the specific circumstances of Megxit, it was the difference between being able to stay gone and being financially compelled to return. Spare, published on January 10, 2023, was the most detailed account Harry had yet given of what the institution had cost him personally and what he believed it had done to his mother. The title is both self-description and institutional critique. The spare in the heir and spare formulation is the second son, constitutionally necessary as a backup, psychologically defined by comparison to someone else's primacy, raised within a system that simultaneously requires his existence and declines to grant it full significance. Harry chose the word deliberately. He named his memoir after his institutional designation, which is a way of saying, this is what the system decided I was, and this book is what that decision produced. He described in Spare driving through the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris, the tunnel where Diana's Mercedes crashed on August 31, 1997, attempting to physically inhabit the space of her death. He described refusing to accept that Diana was dead until he was 23 years old, 11 years after the crash. 5 years of adult life spent in functional denial of something he knew to be true. He had walked behind her coffin at 12. He had served in Afghanistan at 22. He had represented the Crown at hundreds of official engagements, smiled at press events, maintained the required face. The grief had been suppressed across all of it, daily, for 11 years, until he forced himself to stop suppressing it. In Spare, Harry wrote, "My problem has never been with the monarchy, nor the concept of monarchy." The sentence is careful and precise. It prevents the memoir from being read as Republican polemic and makes it something more specific and more uncomfortable for the institution. A critique of the machinery by someone who believes in the principle and objects to the practice. Diana had navigated the same distinction in 1995. She told the Panorama audience she wanted to be a queen in people's hearts. She didn't want the crown abolished. She wanted it to stop treating its members as logistics problems. Harry's framing, 30 years later, is structurally identical. Opposition to specific mechanisms, stated from outside the institution, using the tools Diana had pioneered. He also described his relationship with William in terms that were direct. He characterized William, at certain points in the memoir, as his arch-nemesis. The word is uncomfortable alongside the image of two boys, aged 12 and 15, walking behind their mother's coffin in September 1997. It captures something the institution created and required them both to embody. Heir and spare, the one whose significance the system confirms, and the one whose significance the system qualifies. The tension that produced that characterization didn't appear in 2023. It began in Kensington Palace nurseries, was encoded into every public appearance, and was reinforced across 3 decades of a structural dynamic the institution had built and maintained. Richard Kay's account of Diana calling Harry "Good King Harry" acquires additional weight here. Whatever Diana's intention, the psychological effect of a mother privately telling her younger son that the institution's official hierarchy didn't exhaust the truth about who he was, that she privately saw something in him the system had decided to overlook, isn't trivial. It does not disappear at 12 years old. It incubates. In May 2025, Harry's ongoing legal battle over his UK security protections came to a head. After Megxit, the Metropolitan Police protection Harry had held as a senior working royal had been withdrawn. The institutional argument was procedural. Police protection at that level is allocated on the basis of active senior royal duties, and Harry had voluntarily ceased performing them. Harry's counter-argument was that the withdrawal was punitive, a consequence of his departure from the institution's approved narrative, dressed as administrative procedure, designed to make visiting the United Kingdom functionally dangerous and thereby to punish his family for leaving. Both positions had been moving through the courts for years. Following a ruling in that case, Harry released a formal statement and gave a BBC interview. He described the process as a stitch-up. He said his hands were tied against forces he couldn't challenge through standard legal channels. The BBC reported he said he would love a reconciliation with the royal family and that he was devastated. In the same public statement, in the same breath, he said, "This all comes from the same institutions that preyed upon my mother, that openly campaigned for the removal of our security." Newsweek's headline on the day the statement landed, "Prince Harry says he's at risk from institutions that preyed upon Diana." The Yahoo News report provided the fuller quote, "This all comes from the same institutions that preyed upon my mother, that openly campaigned for the removal of our security, and that continue." The construction of that sentence is doing exact work. The same institutions. Active, present tense. Preyed upon. Past tense for Diana. Present tense implied for Harry. He was making a specific institutional continuity argument. The mechanism Diana identified in 1995, documented in the Panorama interview as the apparatus that briefed against her, questioned her mental stability, and eventually expelled her, was operating in 2025 on the same fundamental logic. The methods had evolved, hacked phones and coordinated briefings, replacing the Bayswater back alley meetings and strategic leaks of the 1990s. The structure had not evolved. The outcome was the same. A family member who had stepped outside the institution's approved narrative found themselves without protection, fighting through courts for basic physical safety, while the institution described each specific decision as procedural rather than punitive. Return now to Richard Kay's March 2026 podcast and to what the Good King Harry nickname actually means, held against everything that came after it. William was 43 years old in March 2026, heir apparent to King Charles III, father of 3 children who would follow him. The constitutional arithmetic has never been uncertain. Diana knew what primogeniture was. She understood, precisely, the legal architecture of succession. If she called Harry Good King Harry, she wasn't drafting alternative legislation. What she was doing was making a private character assessment, offered to the journalist she trusted most, about the son the institution had designated as secondary. And that assessment, reportedly, was that she saw in Harry what the official hierarchy had decided to overlook. The experts who appeared on Good Morning Britain after the story broke were probably right that this was emotional equalization rather than constitutional strategy. They were right that Diana was emotional, often erratic, and working with a 12-year-old she couldn't yet fully know. The nickname was almost certainly maternal comfort, before it was anything else. Maternal comfort, though, transmitted from a woman who had spent 15 years inside the institution and understood exactly what it did to the people it designated inconvenient, is a specific kind of gift. It isn't a strategy. It's a lens. Harry grew up with 2 simultaneous truths about himself. The institutional truth, which said he was the spare, the backup, the secondary consideration, and the private truth, reportedly given to him by his mother and confirmed to Kay, which said the official assessment was incomplete. The tension between those 2 positions, sustained across 30 years, is the engine of everything Harry has done since January 2020. He didn't become king. He became something the institution had not specifically prepared for. A member of the family who absorbed what his mother showed him, that the machine could be named, that naming it publicly was a form of power, that it came at enormous cost, and then named it anyway. He used the tools Diana had pioneered, the unauthorized interview, the memoir, the direct address to a global audience. He has done it repeatedly and at escalating cost, losing his title, his security, his institutional funding, his relationship with his father and his brother, his country of residence. Kay's account of Diana calling Harry Good King Harry is contested, single-sourced, and nearly 3 decades old. What isn't contested is that Diana gave the 1995 Panorama interview, that it described a documented institutional mechanism, that the mechanism has since been confirmed in court, and that Harry has spent 5 years in explicit public conflict with the institution Diana described in 1995, citing in sworn testimony, in a memoir, in an Oprah interview watched by 49 million people, and in a May 2025 BBC statement, the same institutional logic his mother named 30 years earlier. Diana wasn't always right. The Panorama interview's ethical standing was substantially damaged by the BBC's own 2021 inquiry, which found that Martin Bashir used deceptive methods, forged documents, false claims about palace surveillance, to persuade Diana to participate. Diana herself managed the press through the same covert information channels she accused the palace of deploying against her. Her mental health in the mid-1990s was genuinely fragile, not merely a palace talking point. Fitzwilliams described her on Good Morning Britain in March 2026 as deeply emotional and very often erratic. That is the contemporary record, not retrospective palace spin. None of it changes what the Panorama interview documented. The system Diana described, the briefings, the coordinated character management, the managed information architecture that could render a family member unstable in the public record when the institution needed them quiet, has been confirmed by legal proceedings that produced damages, rulings, and sworn testimony. The phone hacking was proven in court. The secret agreement Harry alleged between the palace and the tabloid group was stated under oath. The invisible contract Harry described to Oprah was reported by The Guardian and Business Insider as his own language. Diana's warnings about the institution were treated in 1995 as the bitterness of a woman the palace had successfully characterized as paranoid and unstable. The briefings that built that characterization were real. They are part of the documented record now, confirmed by the subsequent legal history. The palace internal statement that they didn't want another Diana, reported in the palace papers, confirms that the institutional response to her resistance had been to categorize it as a threat to be neutralized. Harry didn't construct the narrative he has been living since January 2020. He inherited it, confirmed it through 2.5 decades of personal experience inside the institution, documented it in legal proceedings that produced verifiable court records, and named it in public statements that Diana would have recognized immediately, because she used the same language first. Whether Diana called Harry Good King Harry as her private conviction, or as a mother's tender reassurance to a boy she knew would be told he came second, the psychological effect across 30 years is the same. His mother, who understood what the institution could do, believed privately that it had misjudged him. That belief became a lens. Harry has looked through it at everything the institution has done, and at everything it did to her. She showed him the machine existed. She showed him, by doing it herself, that you could name it in public. She showed him it cost everything. He named it anyway. Subscribe for more stories like this.